Welcome to Move Like This, brought to you by the Accounting Move Project and sponsored by Moss Adams and Sapro. On this podcast, we share ideas and hear from guests about how they find, retain, develop, and advance women and other underrepresented groups in their accounting firms. Now, on to our guest. Hello, and welcome to this episode of Move Like This. I am excited to be here with Safiya Reid. She is the AVP of Employee Engagement at Pure Insurance. So, first of all, thank you for being here today.
Thank you for having me, Bonnie. I'm excited to chat with you.
So I know I just said that she is from an insurance company, and this is typically accounting, but there's a big reason for this. One of my favorite people, Siri Spey, was recently chatting with me and a couple of other friends, and she mentioned that she was at a conference where she heard Safiya speak. And I wanted to have her on the podcast, wanted to learn more about the topic that she was discussing. And so, before we dive too deep into this, I would love for you to just tell me a little bit about yourself, what you do, and particularly what brought you to the DEI work that you currently do and are so passionate about.
Again, thank you for having me, Bonnie. I, much like most people in insurance, fell into it and said, oh, okay, I think I'll stay a while. And so when I got here, I was actually the office manager for a brand new location in Roswell, Georgia, that had just opened. And then, but with three people in the office, not a ton of office to manage. And so I started working on some ad hoc projects around compliance and tax reporting for our non-admitted insurance markets and learned a lot about that because when I was tasked with it, I actually had no idea what non-admitted markets were. And so had to do a little research there. And that kind of parlayed into some opportunities where as the office grew, as the business grew, I started doing compliance full time, moved into that role. And then right when I thought I was going to make a jump to kind of have some technology um, kind of innovations with the work that we're doing, kind of working along with RPA, robotic process automation, to kind of make systems a little bit easier, processes a little bit easier for the folks that are in that day to day. 2020 happened. Um, And so at the time, our head of HR, while we were in lockdown and COVID, began sending daily emails to the entire organization first thing in the morning at 9 a.m. And the thinking behind that was with all the chaos, with all the uncertainty, at least let's be able to have one mainstay that people can become used to. And it just feels like we're all in this together. And so sometimes it was tips and resources about what to do, how to work remotely, since by and large, the organization hadn't done that prior to, outside of like our general adjusters, or the people that are just naturally in the field sales. But then George Floyd, social uprising happened that weekend. And Monday morning, our CEO at the time, who was our original founder, he opted in, and we didn't get a message from our head of HR. We got a message from him. And he basically was kind of like outlining his own experiences and kind of realizations in the aftermath of George Floyd. And he did a call out for people, who wanted to share or had something to say, to welcome, to respond to that message. And I remember reading it thinking, all right, that was nice. Glad he said, it was nice to hear something, but I had no intention of responding, like zero. And then I get into a leadership meeting regularly scheduled. And for whatever reason, it was just more pronounced that morning that I was the only person of color on our leadership team. And certainly when I started in the role initially, I was the only woman in the office for like 8 months as it was growing. So it's not, I was never made to feel isolated. I always felt included. But that morning it just felt louder. And so I got off the call and I started typing. And before I knew it, I had shared quite a bit of experiences and how it's all kind of connected. And although Pure has been particularly a safe place for me, prior to Pure, I'd worked a lot of different industries, but never worked anywhere longer than like a year or two. Some places I quit first week. I've quit on a day two before because I knew this was just not going to work. And so at that point to have been at Pure 4 years, that was kind of like a testament to the environment that I had of growth and development and someone that was like personally invested in developing me. And so I shared that, but I also shared the realities of being a Black woman in America, the fact that I'd been pulled over 2 blocks away from our office before in Roswell, Georgia, and questioned what I was doing in the area. And I'm like, leaving work. Or the fact that at the time I had a cousin who had been incarcerated for over a decade. And in addition to the COVID outbreak, there was already a Legionnaire's disease outbreak that was happening in her prison that I had been trying to kind of draw some attention to. And so all of these different factors, I was like, they're all kind of connected. And so I don't get to leave those parts of me when I work, they're here. And so I remember typing the email up and looked at my soon-to-be husband. We were actually going to be planning to get married like the week after that. And I said, "Are we okay with me being fired today?" And, and I read it to him, and he was like, "We're okay with you being fired today." And so I sent that message off, and I honestly logged off for the rest of the day. Went down to the CNN Center where there were some protests going on and participated in that. And then when I got back, I had a message from the head of our HR. And I called her back and she said, we got a lot of responses to Ross's email. Most of them were just, people just excited and, proud that this was our positioning and that there was some acknowledgement of what was happening around us. She said, but then we got a couple emails like yours, ones that made us want to take a look at ourselves in the mirror and really examine whether or not we're living out our values each day. And so we had a frank conversation, and then I had a message from our CEO, shortly thereafter, acknowledging it. And that would actually be the catalyst for them creating the DEI role at Pure. And I applied for it a couple of weeks later. And I never had any intention of being in DEI. I was familiar with the space. I was familiar with the work that people were doing in other organizations. But it all from the outside in, it always felt like checking the box. And so this was really a unique opportunity to do, and quite frankly, some of the work that I had already been doing. I had involved our TA down at recruiting events at Spelman and Morehouse, and they had flown down here. So I was already involved in doing the work because I'm a firm believer in that DEI is everyone's responsibility, but never formally in name. And so I put together a plan for how we could build a function and what that would look like. And that's essentially what I interviewed with. And that is how I moved in. I fell into an insurance and then kind of stumbled into DEI just because of the timing and haven't looked back since.
I love that so much. And in part, it's amazing because it was also George Floyd's murder that got me into this.
Wow. Mhm.
And part of that is, um, you know, I've had friends that are, all ethnicities, gay friends, on and on my entire life. And hearing their stories was always hard, but I didn't really know, is there anything I can do?
Right.
And then that to me was a catalyst of, I do want to try and do something. And I had a lot of conversations with particularly Black friends, but also gay friends. And I'm like, this is something I want to pursue. I am also very aware of the fact that I am a middle-aged, straight white woman. And, I don't ever want to put it out there that I understand what it's like to be anything else but what I am. And I got a lot. These are people that will be honest with you and say those pants make your butt look big kind of people. And asked me a lot of questions, but they also said, you know what, in some cases, you sharing this message as a white woman, it's going to be heard a little bit easier than it is from somebody who is not. And while I think on its face there's a problem with that statement in and of itself, if that's something that I can do, then I felt like that was something I wanted to try to do. So, yeah, and I also love the fact that you were bold and that was rewarded, that was heard. And a lot of times I think people are afraid to do that. And there's reason why. And, I don't judge anybody that takes a different path. But I love that that is how you got to where you are and that how we're here sitting here today. Um, so as somebody who's been in the DEI space for, I guess we're looking at 4 years or so now, um, I see a lot of conversation and have had a few conversations about companies and accounting firms pulling back on their commitments out of concern about pushback on DEI initiatives. Um, Statistically, this is led by a really pretty small but vocal contingent of naysayers. And I've got some charts and links to things that I'll include in the show notes. But I really kind of wanted to ask you in your work, what are you hearing out there? And are you seeing some of that same reluctance and pushback from companies and individuals?
Well, there's certainly a lot of headlines because it's just, we're in an age of media where it's all about clicks. And right now, DEI is a really entertaining punching bag for sure. And so, where I met the ever so delightful Siri that we share in common was at the National African American Insurance Association. And so and I was hosting a workshop on DEI, and part of the intro to it was like, look, I know there's a lot of fodder. I know there's a lot of talk that's going on, but we're not going to focus on that, right? Those are the headlines. And by no means do they represent or is it indicative of what's actually going on the ground. And so we actually did a live poll right there in that room to see how is DEI advancing in insurance. And so I asked, since 2020, is your career in a better position than is today than it was then? And the overwhelming majority of the room said yes, right? Also asked some additional questions about whether folks' companies were advancing, where they were kind of in that DEI maturity model standpoint. Like, are they right there on the beginning, or are they, do they have policies embedded in the organization? And again, by and large, the majority of of the people representing that, like the overwhelming majority of the people representing that room, come from organizations that have maintained their commitments and are still doing the work. And so, people will, and by people, this small but vocal group will say, well, I don't like the term. And the reality is that no matter if we would have called it lily flowers, it was going to be a problem, right? It did, because it's not about the terminology. It's just easy to get stuck on that. The thing is that folks feel that we're playing a zero-sum game, and more for me means less for you. And that's never the case. And so I said, we're not going to relitigate the purpose and the value of equity. Like, we're just not going to do that. We're not going to relitigate the purpose of needing to feel included, like you are part of something that's bigger than yourself. Like, that would be a royal waste of our time. What we're going to talk about is how to spot when your companies are regressing versus progressing, because I believe an effective DEI role ultimately works themselves out of a job, because DEI has become so far embedded within every corner of the organization. It's on the top of everyone's minds. It's in OKRs. It's thought of in every action, move, and decision that's made, that you don't need a central person for it because it's everywhere. And so when you see companies scaling back or firing their DEI person, at first glance, you could say, Well, maybe they just worked themselves out of the job. Or is it the fact that we're slowly prioritizing other things over what we know to be important? And so that's the conversation that we had. Like, what are the points of progress? How do you know that you're still moving in the right direction? How do we keep moving that needle forward? Because if we get caught up in the headlines, we'll never get any work done. We'll keep starting back at square one, calling it something else. And it's like, no, it's about the work. And how do we continue doing the work?
Yeah, it's kind of funny to me because I have been part of some conversations where they're like, "Well, should we call it something else?" And I'm like you say, you can call it whatever you want to. And also this is about people.
Yeah.
And that's something else we have to kind of remind ourselves of, I think, in some cases, is this is not a big, lofty philosophy necessarily. This is about individuals and creating
Mhm.
workplaces where people, like you say, feel like they're included and even more importantly, feel like they belong there.
Yeah, and that there's opportunities for advancement and that the work that they're doing contributes because everybody wants to be on a winning team and be feel like an equal contributor on a winning team. And so how do we connect with how do we one keep a pulse on our folks? And that's where I think DEI and employee engagement are so inextricably tied together, is that it's about the people and how are the people feeling? Do they feel like there are opportunities around them to not just develop and grow, but to also advance and be able to contribute and have outsized impact. What are the barriers and obstacles to that sex? It's not about giving anything else to someone else. It's about removing the obstacles that may appear. And I remember during my interview process for the DEI role, I was like, look, I've had a fantastic run at this organization. But I know that my experience isn't indicative of everyone else's experiences that may or may not look like me. So what are the obstacles? So that's how I look at DEI work, is identifying what those obstacles are and then removing them. It's not about adding, it's about removing the obstacles for people. But you got to be connected. You got to have a pulse on the people. You got to talk to people in order to be able to do that. And that was one of the first things I did in this role. One, I felt like I had an idea of the culture of the organization because I'm a part of it. And so it wasn't like I'm starting from scratch trying to learn the nuances of an organization. That was already built in, which is why I say I probably would not have done or considered a DEI role outside of the organization I was already in. I'm a firm believer that that person should be in the organization. Are there exceptions? Sure. But there's just such a great deal of value you have when you're coming from the other side. So yeah, one of the first things I did, we had this thing called coworker coffee, which started during COVID, where you're matched with a different person in the department every 2 weeks, and you just have time, for a 30-minute, virtual chat. And it's just to kind of get people connected in the organization. And so because I was helping manage the ambassador team, I was able to tip my hand on the scale and said, well, instead of matching me with one person, match me with 20 every 2 weeks. And so that was a really easy way, kind of passive, to just have these random conversations with people throughout the organization. And then I also had some individual ones that I did with folks from marginal backgrounds. And like, that's where it's like, okay, I don't just have anecdotal stories. Like, I have real qualitative data about what the experiences are of the people in this organization, what the obstacles are. And now we can create a plan to go remove those obstacles.
One of the reasons that I share that DEI is critical to firms is, frankly, it's the differing perspectives and experiences that it brings to the table. And, so when all the people leading any business all look the same, they come from similar backgrounds, they live in similar communities, or even in sometimes the same communities, and have comparable work experiences, your perspective is limited. You only have your perspective, and therefore your problem solving and approach to competition is also going to be limited, right? So that is one of the things that sometimes will break through to those that aren't necessarily proponents of expanding the playing field per se. So how do you overcome some of these types of objections and show that DEI is valuable when you're talking to skeptics?
To be quite honest with you, I'm not talking to skeptics.
I love that.
And that's not because I don't want to, but the reality is I'm just not surrounded by skeptics. I'm surrounded by, for the most part, people that either prioritize it completely and get it, or at the worst, are indifferent. But I'm not surrounded by people that are fighting me on anything. And I know those conversations are happening in general across the board, but they're not happening with me. By the time it gets to me, they figure some things out, and like that's just it's not a conversation to have. And quite frankly, it's not our job. It's not our responsibility to change the mind of skeptics either. They are vastly in the minority. And I think when we give them too much attention, it over magnifies their perspective. And then we get caught up in using the not just the actual time, but the mental and the emotional toll that it takes when that could be going towards removing obstacles for the people that are struggling. By and large, the skeptics of DEI are already sitting at the table, and this is general across the board, not at Pure, but they're already sitting at the table with everything that they could want and need. So they don't need my help, which means they don't need my attention. And it's just a better use of my time to focus on the people that do.
I love that. And I'm glad to hear that. And maybe this goes to, the different industries that we're in, or in some cases, the different roles that we're playing. But I do run into skeptics. So I love the idea that our future may not include as nearly as many skeptics.
Yeah. They're just, people are old. You're going to have skeptics, for absolutely any and everything. And it's just, if we focus, like I said, it's just a better use of our time to not ignore them. Like, am I mindful about communication, as to not cause any uproar? Am I mindful of the fact that some of what is driving some skeptics is underlying of that is a fear that this is somehow going to take away from them? Am I mindful of that? Yes. Does that inform the language that I use when we talk about different things? Sure. But does it change the work that we're doing? Absolutely not.
No, totally agree there. So I want to talk a little bit about the 5 stages of DEI maturity that you mentioned a little bit earlier, and that I know you also shared in the presentation that brought us together today. So where do you find that most businesses are in their progression, and what does it take to move forward toward maturity?
So it's hard to say exactly where folks are. I think when Harvard Business Review did their study, it was an international study that included, I think, about 3,000 companies. They found that most are stuck in the compliant phase, and that was across all industries. And so essentially, especially now with states like California, states like Louisiana, like there are certain, whether it's every year or every 2 years, there are just certain data metrics that we're required to report on now. And that certainly wasn't the case, 5 or 6 years ago. So whether companies, depending on what industry you're in, want to be, I think being aware of it is, I think most folks are aware that DEI is alive and well. But some are being thrusted into the compliance stage because they have no choice. I think where we sit at as an organization is somewhere in between tactical and integrated. But ultimately, we are looking to get to that sustainable level where I said, we don't have a job. Like that is the goal, is to work myself out of a job where you don't need a central person. I think when you have a central person, that's where things can be a little fickle, because if that one person leaves, then what happens to all the work that's being done. And, in the same way that, so it's important to have succession planning. It's important to have one, it not rest on one sole person. I think that's a mistake that I see in a lot of organizations where when they do make this change, where they're saying, okay, we want to be aware, we want to become an active participant and making sure that there's equity in our policies, and that we're driving inclusion around the organization and that we have a demographic that is reflective of the communities that we live and serve in. They get stuck with just that one person because number one, it's a lot of mental and emotional toll to do the work. And so you're setting that person up for failure on even with the best of intentions. If it's just one person, you're setting them up for failure. Because there needs to be an additional person. So I was thankful when I got into this role. Quite a few people had applied for the DEI role, and they only had an intention of hiring one. But through the interview process, they recognized one, there's a lot of great ideas, a lot of talent that we have sitting here, and maybe this isn't one role, maybe it's two. And so they pivoted, and I think that's an important attribute of an organization is, not saying, well, this is the way we planned it and this is the way it has to be done, is to have that flexibility to pivot and say, actually, we learned more about our organization through this interview process than we thought. And it isn't one person, it's actually two. And so I started off we called ourselves, well, we were affectionately named as the DEI duo, and then we just kind of ran with it. But I don't know what I would have done. I don't know what I would have been able to accomplish and for how long with, trying to do this by myself. And so I think it's important when folks are making an intentional decision that there's at least some sort of, number two in command, even if not in title, but, maybe it's a shared resource between, some separate departments. Maybe it's, in our case, it was someone in talent acquisition because, we did not look like the communities that we live and work. It's very clear. Like the folks that we do have that are from marginalized background are experiencing a great deal of mobility and success in the organization, but it's not a lot of them. And so we know that as the similar to what you were talking about with accounting firms, like as the especially in our industry, which is specific, not just insurance, but high net worth insurance, as the wealth gap closes, that means you're going to have a lot more people that don't look like the traditional picture of wealth, and what voices are at the table that are going to make sure that we can service their needs, and understand their needs appropriately so that we can deploy solutions to it. So super important, but like I said, a lot of folks are kind of stuck in that compliant phase. But how you move forward is a pulse check with the people. Like your DEI program is not one size fits all. I meet with a lot of our brokers who we have, relationships with that just says, hey, can you kind of come in and just help us assess where we're at? And I'll do that all day, every day. I'm like, here's where you're at. But in order to talk about where you're going, you gotta know what the people want and need. What are the obstacles? Because if your DEI programming is all one size fits all, you're never going to move out of whatever aware or compliance stage that you're in. It has to be rooted and centered in the needs of the people that you're serving. And if you're not, then that's where you're just checking the box. You're just doing it for show. You just want something for your website. And I just think collectively as an employee population, that's like behind us. Like we're not going back to that. We're moving forward. Whether, you call it something different or not, the work is still being done.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and as you may or may not know, since we are in different industries here, the accounting profession is currently facing a unprecedented talent shortage. That there may be something similar in your industry, I do not know. But what advice would you have for accounting firm leaders or even individuals within these firms to help them create more inclusive cultures where people want to work and where they feel like they belong?
Yeah, well, the first step is taking care of the folks that you do have already, making sure that folks from marginalized backgrounds in the organization, um, are happy because one, those are your best and most useful referral sources right there. So I know for us, we were facing in Pure, we were facing a bit of a shortage, particularly like in our service organization. And so we thought long and hard about the profile of candidate that we always go for and said, all right, well, one, it's not having the intended impact and the results that we want, and it's by that means it's not sustainable. So what let's go down to the core of who of the people that we're really looking for, and what we found is, those profiles tended to look like teachers. They tended to look like folks that have worked in retail before, or currently working in retail. It also looked like moms who had taken some time off from work to maybe raise some very young children and were getting ready to head back into the workforce. And so we were able to create a whole new profile of candidates, specifically to fill that need. And had we kept doing the exact same thing, we would have, insanity, ended up with the same results, and we would have, continued to kind of bleed in that regard. So one, it's about getting down to the core of, because of what is needed to do the specific job, and not being so stuck in, well, this is the folks that we've always gone after. It's not working anymore, and there's not enough of those folks. So you have to expand. And there are people, extremely bright and intelligent people, particularly restaurant, like I tell everyone, like everyone should work in a restaurant at least once in their life, just so that, the level of multitasking, the ability to keep your composure when things are going left. Like those are core skill sets that, regardless of what job you're doing in an accounting firm, in an insurance company, those are core skills and capabilities that are valuable. So it's like getting down to the human qualities of it all, like getting off of the bullet points of the resume and getting down to the human qualities. What does it take to be successful in this role? But part of that is also defining what does success look like in this role, which can also be a sticking point for folks. So that has to be clear. Those expectations need to be set forth for the folks that are already doing the work. And then you can then get down to the profile of what are the true kind of core personalities, traits that you're looking for. And then where do those exist outside of the people that you're currently looking for? And so that's a really easy targeted way to expand for like a shortage. And I think outside of that, certainly LinkedIn is a great resource. We have taken a lot of our ERG activity because they do some phenomenal work, and we've purposed that into like a LinkedIn campaign. And so that's, we were able to get almost 500,000 impressions, and that's slowly but surely letting people know Pure is a place where people from diverse backgrounds can come, can thrive, and have exciting careers and feel included and a part of something bigger. And so it's not a one approach thing. It's like a full court press. And you have to look at it from every angle and have a plan in place for every angle and execute on every single one of those angles. And then you have to assess, is it working? Is it not? And it's not scrap the whole thing. It's like, okay, well, let me look at this one thing and how can we pivot from here? Or do you just say, this isn't working, and come up with something brand new and have the wherewithal to do that as well. So it's a multi-pronged approach. It is not just one thing. And if folks find themselves looking at it from that linear stance, one twig breaks and that's it. So it has to be multi-pronged.
No, I agree. And that is some of the conversation that's going on in the profession is we've been fishing from the same waters for a long, long time. And that pond is relatively dry at this point. So where can we go and expand? And I love your approach to that. Well, before we end this conversation, I feel like we could talk all day. I have a couple of fun questions that entertain me. So I am curious, when you were 5 years old or around that age, what did you want to be when you grew up?
Ah, I remember this vividly. I wanted to be an astronaut, and my mother told me, find something on the ground. And so as an adult now, I'm like, oh my gosh, she literally grounded my dreams. Like I could have been, up at the Starliner stuck in space right now, waiting for SpaceX to come save me from Boeing's failures. I could have been, who knows? But yeah, I remember that so very vividly. And so, I probably would have fallen out of it somewhere about high school when I realized chemistry and the sciences in general wasn't going to be my jam. But still, I could at least had like 10 or 15 years where I thought of, yeah, I'm going to be an astronaut. So,
I like it. Uh, so, kind of in that same vein, if you were given the chance to travel anywhere for free, don't have to worry about time off, none of that stuff. You just get to go. Where would you go and why?
it would probably be the next trip that I'm planning right now, which is Tanzania and Zanzibar in Africa. I want to do a safari, but like I want to like rough it at the safari. Like I want to be on in tents on the ground. I want to hear a rhino breathing heavily over me at night. I want to be in fear for my life that we may not make it to the next morning. And then when we get to Zanzibar, I want to live like kings and queens once we once we get over there and lieges and all that good stuff. But I'm trying to plan some stuff for some folks right now, but no one's really biting on the roughing it part of the safari. They want the red carpet rolled. And I'm like, it's a safari. This is not the place for the red carpet. Not at all.
Well, I actually have one of my best friends in the world served in the Peace Corps in Tanzania.
Oh,
So
wow.
put you in touch with her and she can tell you about roughing it and scorpion. I remember stories about scorpions that gave me a little bit of pause, but
Oh gosh, I never considered the scorpions. I'm only
yeah, yeah. But yeah, I can introduce you for sure. And finally, if you could have one superpower, what would it be?
oh, invisible. That's easy. I'm hopping on flights. I'm sitting in Delta One Premium. No one's gonna know that I'm there. Yeah, it would either be that or time travel. But I feel like being invisible is that checks all the boxes.
I think that would be a very interesting superpower to have for sure. Well, thank you so much for being here today. I've thoroughly enjoyed our conversation and look forward to continuing this conversation down the road as well.
It was a pleasure, Bonnie. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to Move Like This, brought to you by the Accounting Move Project and sponsored by Moss Adams and SACPRO. If you'd like to learn more, visit our website at accountingmoveproject.com. Don't forget to subscribe and share with your friends and colleagues too. I'm your host, Bonnie Buell Russick, and until next time, keep moving forward.